On the evening of October 14, 1988, the gymnasium beneath the main stage of the Brussels International Martial Arts Expo held approximately 340 people, not the arena upstairs, where the demonstrations were scheduled, the room underneath it. A converted storage hall with exposed overhead pipes and a concrete floor covered by 2 layers of interlocking foam mat. The ceiling was 11 feet high. The fluorescent strips ran in 4 parallel rows, and one of them, the second from the left, had been flickering since 4 in the afternoon and nobody had fixed it. The 340 people in that room were not a general audience, they were practitioners. Tournament directors, coaches who had been coaching since before some of the athletes in the room had been born, journalists who covered the circuit and had seen enough to know the difference between performance and the real thing. They were there for a closed evening session, invitation only, and most of them had arrived early because the word moving through the corridors upstairs was that something was going to happen tonight that was worth arriving early for. Jean-Claude Van Damme was 27 years old. He stood 5 feet 11 inches and weighed 185 pounds of competition-conditioned muscle built across 15 years of daily training that had begun when he was a child in St. Agatha Berkham and had not stopped for a single week since. He carried 3 Belgian karate championship titles, a European title in full contact karate,
and a tournament record that read at the time of that evening, 44 wins against 4 losses. He had studied under Claude Guetz. He had cross-trained in Muay Thai under trainers who did not soften the instruction. He had completed 2 years of classical ballet, not for the art of it, but because a trainer had told him it would make him faster, and the trainer had been correct.
He was also, at that particular moment in his career, ascending, not yet the name he would become, but moving. The film work was beginning, the right doors were opening in the right sequence. He had demonstrated that evening in the main arena upstairs to extended applause, and he had done it correctly, without showboating, and the 340 people downstairs knew it. They had been upstairs. They had watched. In the next 11 seconds, Jean-Claude Van Damme was going to do something that nobody in that room had seen anyone do before. Not to that particular man. Not in a setting like that. Not without warning. Nobody standing in that gymnasium on October 14, 1988, understood yet that they were about to carry the story of those 11 seconds for the rest of their lives. Jean-Claude Van Damme had arrived in that room with a purpose he had been carrying for 3 weeks. It began with a magazine, a French-language martial arts publication, the kind that circulated through the European circuit and was read carefully by the people who trained seriously, and ignored by everyone else. The issue had run a retrospective on American martial arts cinema and its relationship to authentic fighting tradition. The article was thorough, it was respectful in most of its treatment, but in one paragraph, in a piece that discussed the gap between cinematic martial arts and competitive martial arts, the author had made a comparison. The comparison used Chuck Norris as its primary example of the cinematic figure. The phrasing had been measured, but Van Damme had read it again, and had formed a conclusion about what the comparison implied, rightly or wrongly, and the conclusion had not sat well inside him. He was 27. He was Belgian. He was in a foreign country pursuing a career that required him to be taken seriously, and the question of whether his background was being taken seriously was not an abstract one. It was the axis around which every decision he made in that period rotated. He carried that magazine for 3 weeks. He did not speak about it to his training partners. He spoke about it once to his trainer, briefly, and his trainer had said something practical and forgettable, and Van Damme had nodded, and the conversation had ended. But the thing he carried did not end. He had found out that Chuck Norris would be at the Brussels Expo. He had found out about the closed session. He had arranged his invitation through a contact in the tournament directorate, a man named Michel Beaumont, who had known Van Damme since the Belgian championship years, and who later said, when asked about that evening, that he had noticed something different about the way Van Damme moved through the door when he arrived. Not nervous. The opposite of nervous. Beaumont said he looked like a man who had already made a decision, and was simply walking toward the consequence of it. Chuck Norris was 48 years old. He had entered the room in a gray sweatshirt with no marking on it, dark trousers, and canvas training shoes that had been worn down at the outer heel. He was sitting in the 4th row from the front, left of center. With a paper cup of coffee balanced on one knee and a conversation going with the man beside him, a Korean-American tournament director named James Soo, who had judged 17 national-level competitions, and who would later describe the evening in a deposition related to an entirely separate matter, and whose account remained consistent across every telling. Norris had not announced his presence when he entered. He had not sought the front row. Nobody on the organizing committee had placed a reserved marker on his seat. He had come in through the side entrance with two other people and had found a seat in the middle of the room the way a man does when he is not interested in being found. The cap was low. The coffee cup was real. He had been competing since 1964. He had retired from competition in 1974 undefeated, with a record that included the professional middleweight karate champion of the world title, which he had held for 6 consecutive years. He had founded his own system. He had trained under Bruce Lee. He had built a film career that had made him, by 1988, one of the 3 or 4 most recognizable martial arts figures on the planet. He had done all of this quietly, without the kind of self-promotion that the circuit associated with performers rather than practitioners. He did not look, sitting in the 4th row with a paper cup of coffee, like a man who needed anything from the evening. If you want to know how those 11 seconds ended, make sure you are subscribed and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching this from tonight. Van Damme had moved through the session without disruption for the first hour and 20 minutes. He watched the demonstrations. He applauded where applause was given. He spoke to the people near him in a low voice, and did not draw attention to himself in any way that the people around him later identified as deliberate. James Soo, who was seated 6 rows back, said that he became aware of Van Damme's location in the room sometime around the 90-minute mark, when the formal demonstrations had concluded, and the room had relaxed into the informal period that often followed closed sessions like this one, a period where the credentials in the room began to interact with each other and the structure of the evening dissolved. It was during this period that Van Damme crossed the room. He walked at a normal pace, not fast, not slow. He walked the way a man walks when he is covering distance he has already decided to cover. He stopped 7 feet from where Norris was standing, because Norris had stood up from his seat at some point and was now in conversation with Soo and a third man, a Belgian tournament official whose name has not been consistently reported across the various accounts of the evening. Van Damme waited for the natural break in the conversation. When it came, he spoke. He spoke in English, which was his second language, and he spoke it without apology for the accent. He said that he had been carrying a question for 3 weeks and he thought this was the appropriate place to ask it. He referenced the magazine article, not by name, but in enough detail that Norris understood immediately what he was referring to. And then Van Damme said the sentence that became the sentence. He said, "What you do on camera is not what works. Let me show you what works." The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a sequence. The people nearest went quiet first. Then the quiet moved outward in the way that quiet does when something has been said that changes the nature of a room. By the time it reached the back wall, roughly 5 full seconds after Van Damme had spoken, the entire gymnasium was still. Soo said that he put down the glass he was holding. He said he did not remember placing it on anything, but he was not holding it after that. The Belgian official, according to his own account given to a martial arts journalist in 1996, took a single step backward and then stopped moving. The flickering fluorescent strip, the second from the left, had stopped flickering at some point during the evening. Nobody noticed when. It was simply on and steady when the silence came. Chuck Norris looked at Jean-Claude Van Damme for a moment that several witnesses estimated at between 4 and 6 seconds, and during which he did not speak. He set the paper cup down on the back of the nearest seat. He took off the gray sweatshirt and folded it. He folded it once lengthwise and once across and set it on top of the paper cup. He straightened. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt underneath. He said, "All right. He has already lost. He just does not know it yet." What happened next happened in 11 seconds of story time. but it consumed a different 11 seconds than the ones measured on a clock. When 340 trained practitioners are watching something they have not seen before, time behaves differently. The martial artists in that room had spent collective thousands of hours studying the mechanics of violence, and they knew, in the way that expertise makes knowing instantaneous, that what they were about to observe was not a performance. The two men took positions on the foam mat approximately 9 feet apart. This detail was confirmed by Sue and independently by a Belgian journalist named François Derval, who had been covering the circuit for 11 years, and who was standing near the left wall with a notepad he did not open for the duration of what followed. A fight is not two men moving toward each other. A fight begins in the space between them, and the man who understands that space more completely than the other man has already made his first decision before either of them has moved. The 9 feet between Van Damme and Norris was not empty space. It was the opening paragraph of a conversation that was going to be settled in the language neither of them needed words for. In the first second, Van Damme did not move. He held his position with his weight distributed in the particular way that fighters trained in his system distribute weight when they are about to generate speed from stillness. Suh later described it as a coiling, not visible movement, the suggestion of movement about to happen. And the second, he moved. He did not telegraph it. Derval wrote in his account that he did not see the decision before the action and that he had been watching fighters for 11 years and this was not common. The kick came from Van Damme's left side, a turning kick using the full rotation of the hip, and it was not thrown at training speed. It was thrown at the speed a man throws something when the point is to demonstrate what the speed is. It did not land. In the third second, the kick did not land because Norris was no longer in the space the kick was traveling to. He had not blocked it. He had not parried it. He had stepped, a single measured lateral displacement of perhaps 18 inches, and the kick moved through the air where he had been and found nothing. This was the moment when the 340 people in the gymnasium understood what they were watching. In the fourth second, Van Damme recovered. He was a competition fighter, and his recovery was as fast as his generation. He recovered, and he read the distance, and he chose again. In the fifth second, he threw the second technique. A combination this time. A hand strike leading into a secondary movement that he had built over 15 years of training to chain together without pause. The first half of it arrived correctly. The second half did not finish because Norris had moved inside the angle of it and there was no longer a clean line available. Suh, standing 6 rows back, had both hands flat on the seat in front of him. He did not remember putting them there. The Belgian official had not taken another step. He was standing exactly where he had stopped. Derval had not opened the notepad. In the 6th second, Van Damme made a choice that several of the witnesses later identified as the most important moment of the 11. He did not retreat. He pressed.
He understood, in the way a fighter understands through the body rather than through thought, that retreat would not serve him, and he closed the distance to make the third attempt at a range where his particular attributes should have been decisive. They were not decisive.
In the 7th second, Norris did something with his right forearm that 3 witnesses described differently, and that Sue described as a redirection, and Van Damme's third technique ceased to be a technique and became a misaligned position from which the follow-through was no longer available. In the 8th second, Norris was behind him. Not behind him by inches, behind him by the kind of margin that ends conversations. In the 9th second, there was a movement that the witnesses consistently described as minimal. A controlled downward application of leverage applied at a point between Van Damme's shoulder and neck, using a grip whose mechanics Suh later spent 4 minutes attempting to explain to the journalist who interviewed him, and ultimately said simply that it was correct, that the technique was correct in every detail. In the 10th second, Jean-Claude Van Damme was on the mat, not stumbling, not off balance, on the mat, in the particular way that a man arrives on the mat when a technique has been applied correctly to his body, and his body has responded to it without consulting him first. In the 11th second, Norris stood over him and did not press the advantage. He had stopped the motion of his right hand at a point approximately 2 inches from Van Damme's jaw, not a swing. A positioning. A placement that communicated the available geometry of what the next action would have been, without completing it. He held it there for a moment that Sue estimated at 2 seconds, and that Derval estimated at 3. Then he reached down. He extended his right hand open, fingers together, palm facing upward in the gesture that has one meaning in every martial tradition that has ever existed. The gymnasium was the same temperature it had been for the previous 2 hours. Nobody had opened a window. The air had not changed. But Sue said that something changed in the room in that moment, that he could not describe in temperature terms, and did not attempt to. Norris leaned in close as Van Damme took his hand, and he said something. He said it quietly. Only the two of them were close enough to hear it. What he said has not been publicly confirmed by either man in any interview, and the various accounts from witnesses who claim to have heard fragments are inconsistent enough that they cannot be assembled into a reliable sentence. What is consistent across the accounts is what Van Damme did after he heard it. He stood. He straightened to his full height. He looked at Norris for a moment, and then he nodded. Once, the kind of nod that is not agreement with a statement but acknowledgement of a thing that is true. The room remained quiet. Van Damme stood at the fork in the road that every man stands at when a thing has happened in front of witnesses that has not gone the way he arranged for it to go. On one side of that fork is the path that costs more to walk but leads somewhere. On the other side is the path that costs nothing in the moment and leads nowhere. He chose the first path. He turned toward the room. He did not address the whole room. He addressed the people nearest him, which was enough, because the room was quiet and everything carried. He said that he had come into this space with a question, and the question had been answered.
He said that he had learned something specific tonight. He said that he was grateful for it. He did not qualify this. He did not add a sentence after it to soften what it was. He stood in it the way a man stands in the rain, because the rain is there and there is no position available from which it is not there.
James Sue walked across the room and reached Norris as he was picking up the folded sweatshirt. Sue put his hand on Norris's left shoulder for a moment. He said he did not plan to do it. He said his hand simply moved there of its own consideration, the way a hand moves when it needs to confirm that something is real and present and not a thing the mind has assembled from available parts. Norris put the sweatshirt back on. He picked up the paper cup from the back of the seat. He looked inside the cup. The coffee was gone, or it was cold. He set the cup back down. Francois Derval finally opened his notepad. He wrote for 11 minutes without stopping, standing against the left wall, and he said that what he wrote in those 11 minutes was not a description of what he had seen, but an attempt to locate the correct words for what the room had felt like when it was over. He said he never found them, and that the account he eventually published 2 weeks later was a technical description, and not the true account, because the true account required a vocabulary he did not possess. The story moved the way stories move when the people carrying them have enough credibility to give them weight. It moved from Suh to a network of American tournament directors he corresponded with. It moved from Derval's published account into the European circuit journals, and from there into the English language publications that followed the circuit. It moved from the Belgian official into the Brussels training community, and from there outward in the particular way that stories move when the people retelling them were not present and must fill the gaps with what seems consistent. The gaps filled themselves in different directions. Some tellings added a crowd that was larger. Some tellings added words that had not been spoken. Some tellings changed the location from Brussels to Los Angeles and from 1988 to 1991, because the locations and dates that carry the most narrative gravity attract stories toward themselves. The martial arts community is not immune to the process by which oral history mutates. It is subject to it in the same way as every other community, and the mutation is not dishonesty. It is the way human beings translate feeling into detail when the original detail is unavailable. What remained constant across every version, regardless of what changed around it, was the central fact. The central fact was resistant to mutation because it was simple, and because the people who had been present agreed about it without coordination. Van Damme had gone in. Norris had ended it in 11 seconds. Van Damme had stood up and told the truth about what had happened. The second fact, The one about the truth was the one that moved farthest and lasted longest in the accounts of the people who had been there. Suss said, in 2009, 21 years after the evening, that what he remembered most was not the technique. He was specific about this. He said that he had seen exceptional technique in 30 years of competition and that exceptional technique was memorable but not remarkable in the sense of being rare. What was rare was the other thing. The thing Van Damme had done after he stood up. Norris, for his part, did not tell the story. This was reported as consistent with his behavior across similar situations by the three people who knew him well enough to be asked about it. He did not deny the evening when asked about it directly in a 1994 interview, and the non-denial was treated by the interviewer as confirmation. He said only that Brussels had been a good expo, and that the Europeans were serious about their training. Van Damme referenced the evening once in a long-form interview published in 2003, in language that was indirect enough to be technically ambiguous, but clear enough in context to leave no genuine ambiguity. He said that he had, on one occasion in his late 20s, asked a question of someone whose answer he did not expect, and that the experience had been more instructive than a decade of competition. He did not name the person. He did not name the city. He did not need to. The instruction was not in the technique, though the technique was complete. The instruction was in the space between the question and the answer. Van Damme had arrived in that gymnasium carrying a certainty. And the certainty had been a wall between him and a thing he needed to see, and Norris had removed the wall without cruelty, and without ceremony, and without keeping any record of having done so. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be given to a man. It can only be demonstrated in front of him, in a language he already speaks, and he must choose to receive it, or to reject it. And the choice is always his, and never the other man's. Van Damme had chosen to receive it. In front of 340 witnesses without an available excuse and without one offered, he had chosen the harder path at the fork in the road. This is not a story about who was the better fighter. The question of who was the better fighter was answered in the gymnasium in 11 seconds, and it does not require elaboration. This is a story about what a man does with an answer that costs him something. Whether he holds it in both hands and allows it to change him, or sets it down carefully and walks away from it in the direction of a story that is less true but more comfortable. Van Damme held it in both hands. He carried it into the next 15 years of his career, and the people who trained with him in the years after Brussels said that there was a quality in his approach that was different from the approach of other fighters of his caliber. A quality that resisted easy description but that expressed itself as a particular kind of attention he paid to what he did not yet know. This is not a small thing. In a life that requires the management of a considerable public self, the capacity to remain genuinely interested in what you do not yet know is a discipline more demanding than any physical conditioning. Norris drove back to his hotel that evening in a car that a production company had arranged for him. The accounts of that evening do not include anything about the drive. They do not need to. Next week, we will look at the evening in Los Angeles when Steven Seagal discovered that reputation and ability are not the same currency, and that one of them is accepted everywhere.